So good evening, guys. I am here in one of the stock lofts. This is the back compartment of the mobile loft. I've got a couple of black widow babies here. These are from Widowmaker, who you may remember in a past video, who is about 6 to 8 crosses to black widow behind him and a double granddaughter of black widow. That's who their parents are. They're both black white flights. Didn't quite have as much white as I expected. The mother is a pied. One of these is probably going to go to Steve Vulu at Danza Lofts. Probably this one in the front, which I think is a cock. This guy. I think that's the one that's probably going to go to Steve, because he wanted some more black widow blood to work with. So it's probably going to be that one. They're both pretty similar. I think the one in the back is a hen. But in looking at these two black widow babies, one of the things I wanted to talk about is the importance of tail female lines in breeding. And there's quite a few theories about this, and part of the reason I want to bring it up, so if you're not familiar with what a tail female line is, a tail female line is the mother and her mother and that mother's mother down the maternal line. So when you look at a pedigree, the bottom line, that is the tail female line. And there's a lot of theories about the importance of that particular line in the pedigree. And there's actually just as many theories about the tail male line, which is your line at the top of the pedigree. But I wanted to talk about the tail female line. Most of the root behind the tail female line theory goes back to an Australian by the name of Bruce Lowe. And back in the 1890s, Bruce Lowe was a pedigree analysis specialist in racehorses. And Bruce Lowe wrote a book in the 1890s called Horse Breeding by the Figure System. And basically what Bruce Lowe did as a pedigree analyst is he had traced most of the thoroughbred horses at that time back to, I think it was 43 mares originally. So basically he mapped from the start of the thoroughbred racehorse breed, for racing, he pretty much mapped pedigrees dating back to 43 mares, and he gave them each assigned each line a number, and he suggested that this was one way to select racehorses, was to use his number figure system. So you would have line 1 or line 2 or line 3, line 4, line 5, and so on and so forth. And that became a very, very popular way of selecting racehorses for breeding. And even though there really wasn't a lot of explanation on why it was supposed to work, even today, a lot of people who breed racehorses in pedigreed dogs and other animals, they actually still use Bruce Lowe's figure system. So it's interesting how 130 odd years later, it's still very, very prominent in some circles of animal breeding. But when we start looking at genetic science, we start to understand why Bruce Lowe was probably onto something. And the 2 points I will bring up is when you have most animal breeders, they place an awful lot of importance on the sire, on the males. And the main reason people place importance on the males, whether we're talking about racehorses or exhibition dogs, racing pigeons, rollers, rabbits, cattle, sheep, hogs, you name it, a lot of the reason the males are often regarded as the most important by a lot of breeders is the simple fact that a male animal can produce many, many more offspring than the females ever will. The females only have a certain number of viable eggs during their reproductive lifetime, and once they're gone, they're gone. Now, and it applies equally to humans, as we all know. Women have for lack of better explanation, they have a viable reproductive period. It probably ends for the majority of them by time they're, in their late 30s or 40. Now, by contrast, as we all know, a man can continue to make children well into advanced age, even into his 80s and possibly his 90s. So kind of running off the same theory, a lot of people place dramatic importance on the males as far as their breeding choices. However, in the process, when you breed a lot of offspring off a male, you can kind of get an illusion that if you use a male and you use them a lot, let's say you breed them to 3 or 4 different hens and you manage to breed, 25 or 30 offspring or however many, if 1 or 2 are standouts, he seems really good. And he may seem very valuable to us. Now, by contrast, the females have only a set amount of offspring they can produce. In pigeons, it's still actually quite a few. A hen, if you maintain her health properly and you keep good supplements in front of her, you can probably get 75 or 80 offspring out of a hen pigeon. Far more from poultry, obviously. You can breed a very, very large number of offspring from a laying hen. But despite that, in the poultry industry, and especially among exhibition poultry, a lot of people still place the emphasis on the male, basically because a lot of the way that a lot of people breed, which in my opinion as a longtime poulterer is not the way to do it. They can put one male with 10 hens and breed hundreds of offspring in a very short period. But like I said, in my opinion, it is not the way to do it. But that being said, when you have a good hen, you only get so many offspring during her time. But if she is a good producing hen, she can actually be more valuable than the males when it comes right down to it. And there's actually a scientific explanation for this. One is that genes can be tied to the X chromosome. They can be linked genes. We don't know a lot about that in pigeons, with the exception of colors and pigment modifiers. For example, we know that genes like dilute, which is responsible for yellows and cream bars and true silvers and khakis and stuff like that, that is a sex-linked gene, and there are also other sex-linked genes that are specifically tied to the X chromosome. So needless to say, we have no idea in racing pigeons or other breeds, that are bred for performance. There's a likelihood that there are genes that are important to us that probably are linked to the X chromosome, but we just don't know about them yet. There's still a lot of research needs to be done on that. Probably the more interesting facet of that, talking about the female line that proves some scientific basis to Bruce Lowe's theory, was the discovery of mitochondrial DNA. So the interesting thing about mitochondrial DNA, it is only inherited for the most part, 99.99% of the time, through the female. And mitochondrial DNA, unlike nuclear DNA, which is typical DNA when we talk about DNA, mitochondrial DNA has a very, very short strand, and it's not subject much to mutating. So needless to say, where it's not subject to mutating, there are actually intact lines of mitochondrial DNA in all species that are actually thousands of years old and have never actually changed. And as I said, that mitochondrial DNA is typically only inherited through the mother's side. Now, what actually goes on, it's not that the males don't contribute mitochondrial DNA. In theory, the males have their own mother's mitochondrial DNA. And at the time of conception or fertilization, that mitochondrial DNA from the male actually is transmitted to the new organism. Basically when the organism is first formed, it actually is transmitted But what happens is there's actually enzymes involved in the cell division process that it actually devours or destroys the mitochondrial DNA inherited from the male. There are a few instances, like in poultry and other animals, where the male mitochondrial DNA has managed to take hold and exist in the new organism and is passed that way, but it's very, very rare. It's basically a result of, like I said, it's actually kind of an enzyme failure. It's a mutation. But for the most part, other than those rare instances like that, you as a person, you have the mitochondrial DNA of your mother. Whether you are male or female, you inherited it from your mother, and your mother in turn inherited it from her mother, and your grandmother in turn inherited it from her mother, and that is how the chain works. And like I said, there are actually cases where there's mitochondrial DNA in humans that has actually been intact now for thousands of years, that it has not changed. And it's the same in pigeons, and it's the same in horses, and it's the same in other animals. And needless to say, there are these maternal genetic lines as a result of the mitochondrial DNA that pass from generation to generation. Now, we don't know a lot about any aspects of race performance genes being passed through mitochondrial DNA. However, the function of mitochondria, which is what is, basically tied to this, is that it is the source of energy and vitality in the cells of all organisms. So needless to say, if you have really good mitochondrial DNA, you have good growth rates and you have good development functions over maturity and so on and so forth. And needless to say, this could possibly have a major impact on racing pigeons and other performance pigeons, because obviously the health and vitality and functionality of their biological systems is tied to the mitochondrial DNA. So with that in mind, the tail female line could really, really matter very importantly. And a lot of animal breeders well over 100 years now, going back to Bruce Lowe and probably even before Bruce Lowe, have observed that sometimes the female line, the tail female line, has more of an impact on performance and structural quality than all the other branches of a pedigree. And there's plenty of examples in racing pigeons of great female lines, especially tail female lines. The black widow birds are a great example. She has, over many generations now, has produced a lot of top pigeons. Gel Rosier's Queen Elle, another example. A lot of breeders, their real strength, even though they talk a lot about the cockbirds, a lot of times it's actually the hens that are the most important. Look at Frank McLaughlin as an example. Probably the two most prominent pigeons that people really know about that he's bred and owned is his dark hen and the freak, both of which were hens. Rick Nanez's loft, even though ironclad and Constans and the males are very well known, it's not widely known that a pigeon he called Foolish Pleasure, who was his foundation hen, was probably in many ways as responsible, if not more so responsible, for the success of his bloodline. And there's certainly many, many other examples out there. Like in the Portleots, Frau Auntie, once again, a hen. So your hens can really, really matter. I've mentioned in the past that my late aunt was a very, very successful breeder of exhibition dogs, is what she did. And she really went above and beyond anybody in her generation of breeders and her breed of choice. She had a very long-lasting impact that is still going on now after her death 15 years after the fact, and it was pre-existing before that. And her great emphasis, her and I used to have many, many conversations about breeding, and her great emphasis was really on her bitches. that she considered the females far more important than any male she may have had access. And she was well known enough. She had access to any breeding male in the world at that time within her breed. But it was really her females that were the most important to her. And she really worked hard at maintaining her foundation bitch back there in the tail female line. So needless to say, going forward, if you are selecting pigeons, even though it's common for people to really place a lot of emphasis on the good males, if you can get your hands on a very, very good hen and keep basically the daughters and the granddaughters and the great-granddaughters of that hen going forward and really build around the hens, you may find that you're in a pretty good position. And needless to say, it is, with the mitochondrial DNA, the position in the pedigree actually matters quite a bit. So really going forward, if you have an excellent hen, keeping that hen's genes intact down there on that tail female line, that bottom line of the pedigree, can be very, very advantageous. We're kind of only scraping the surface, but we're already 16, 17 minutes into this. So I'm going to cut it off right here. But needless to say, a little bit of food for thought is to watch for really good hens and build your line around the hens. They only produce so many offspring. So when you have a good one, you really need to take the most advantage of it as you can. That's it for this time, guys. Thanks for watching. Tune in next time. I've got some new stock cocks I'm going to show in the next few videos. I've got a loaner from James Robertson that I'm really looking forward to using, that due to his work situation, he's had to kind of farm out a lot of his pigeons, and I have one of them here that I'm very thankful for him trusting me with it. And I've got some other nice cockbirds that I picked up that came in this week that I'm going to be working with next breeding season, if not the late part of this season. And needless to say, we're going to take a look at some of those cockbirds over the next few days. So that is it, guys. Keep them flying out there. And for those of you who are racing young birds, young bird season is pretty much in the swing of things right now in a lot of places. Good luck to all of you out there.